We're working on going live with the streaming, so just one moment. Okay, we're ready. Would you like me to call roll now, Chair?
Yes, please.
Thank you. Robert Heap, Commissioner Heap. Commissioner Heap.
Sorry, Iris, I was on mute. I'm here.
Chair Leak.
Here.
Commissioner Mitchell.
Here.
Commissioner Moreno is still trying to, oh, hold on just a moment. They just joined us. Commissioner Moreno, can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
I can, and so you are obviously present. Thank you. Commissioner Mitchell.
Here.
Thank you. Commissioner Phillips.
Here.
Rigby.
Here.
Stewart.
Here.
Thank you, everyone.
Since we will not have a council update this evening, as the city council is not meeting this month, Iris, do we have any public comments that are not items on the agenda tonight?
The only one we received was the written one that I emailed to all of you.
Okay, super. Thank you very much. Now we need to review the minutes for June 27th and July 11th. And I believe we can vote on passing both of these at the same time unless there's an objection to doing so.
Well, I have to abstain from the second one because I wasn't present.
Okay, well then we'll vote on them separately. The minutes from June 22nd, 2022, are there any additions or corrections? Okay, do we have a motion to pass and approve the minutes?
Move to approve.
Second?
Second.
Thank you. We have a motion to approve them in a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any nays? And okay, any abstentions?
Yeah, Chair Leak, I'll abstain. I was absent on June 27th.
Okay. Now we have July 8th or July 11th, 2022's meeting minutes to approve. Are there any additions or corrections? All right, do I have a motion to approve these?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes from July 11th, 2022.
Thank you. A second?
A second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any nays? And one abstention. The minutes are approved for July 11th, 2022. And now we go to our work session, which is the Community Development Code, the 2022 annual amendments. And work session number 1, LU 22-0038. We will accept public comments. Do we have any?
We had no public comments.
Thank you, Iris. I'm going to let Johanna, Senior Planner, go ahead and present her work session for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Leak. I just need to get set up here. Can everyone see my screen?
You bet.
Okay, so I'm going to minimize you guys on the side so I can see what I'm looking at. I'm dealing with a MacBook Pro here that's a little finicky. And unfortunately, I'm not able to share anything else. I can't toggle back and forth between documents. So I am just going to be presenting this PowerPoint with summaries of the proposed amendments. And from there, hopefully you all have access and readily available the table that has sort of the more detailed description of each of the amendments. Is that acceptable for everyone? Okay, I'm not hearing any dissension, so I'm just going to keep going. Again, I only have one person up on my screen, so let me know if you have questions, just interrupt me. Okay, so as most of you are aware, we do annual code amendments where over the year, staff puts together a list of amendments that we think are necessary to at least discuss further, and we bring them to the Planning Commission. These come from building permits that we're reviewing, land use projects, questions at the counter, but we try to get them through each year so we don't have a buildup of code that doesn't work for us. So this is the first work session for the 2022 annual code amendments. Oh, let's see. It's freezing. Okay, here's the schedule that we have. We're here at August 8th. We're going to come back with the first or the second work session. And that one I'll have actual draft code amendments along with the detailed description of why we're proposing it and what the amendment does. We'll come back on the 26th of September. The hearing right now with you is scheduled for November 28th. And I did build in a little bit of time between the second work session and the hearing, just because there is a lot of code that I'm going to have to be revising. And I want to make sure I've got that dialed in, first of all, the correct code amendments, but also that I get a good amount of time for staff to review it, make sure I'm not, hopefully not creating any unintentional problems with these amendments. We'll adopt findings on December 12th. And then right now, our tentative, we don't have a work session, or sorry, I should say a study session with a council. None of these amendments require Measure 56 notice. There's no takings. There's no extra regulations that are being put on with these amendments. So we're looking at just going straight to public hearing either on the 3rd of January, 2023 or the 17th, I believe. But those will be, we can revisit all of these dates, but depending on what we hear today and as we go through this process. Any questions about that schedule before I keep going? Okay, so as again, you know, the way that we break these up are in maintenance amendments that generally do not involve any policy considerations. They're clarifying code, making sure that it is clear and objective, easy to understand as much as possible for the public, and reflects staff's like smaller maintenance issues. The second group are policy amendments, what we call policy amendments, and those typically take a little bit more public input, discussion with the commission to make sure that we're choosing the right path on it, whether or not we move forward with it. And so we have 18 maintenance amendments right now. That might go down to 17 because I'm going to try to consolidate a couple. And we have 7 policy amendments, one of which I want to continue working with the neighborhood association that this affects. And they may or may not encourage us to move forward, but we'll talk about it tonight. Okay, so maintenance amendments. I put a nice little picture of a picnic here. Hopefully these will be a picnic to go through. Although as you saw by the table that you got, there's a lot of text here. This is kind of a text heavy year, and I apologize for that. And I'll try to hopefully explain this in a way that makes sense. But again, please interrupt me and ask questions if I'm not being clear. So I'm just going to go through these 1 to 18. And as I go through each one, I'll check in with the commission to see if I have your support in moving forward with it. And then, like I said, what we'll do, we'll come back towards the end of September with actual draft amendments. A lot of these, we do have some draft language, but it hasn't been vetted yet. So I have an idea of how these fixes will happen, but not 100% dialed in yet. But again, I can kind of go into details if necessary. So this first one is regarding irregular lots. And the problem that we face, I don't know, 1 to 2 times a year, someone will come to the counter and say, hey, this is my property. What are my setbacks? And we look at the lot and it's so irregularly shaped. We're like, well, we know what your front is because it's the one abutting the street. But the rear are all of the lot lines that are most opposite the front. And then pretty much everything else is a side. And again, sometimes we get these lots that are so oddly shaped, it's a real struggle to figure out what should be a side and then what should be a rear. And that has a big impact on the building envelope because in a lot of zones, the rear yard setbacks are sometimes 4 to 5 times larger than a side yard setback. So there is a definition for a regular lot, and it does include a diagram, and that's in the table before you. And it shows just sort of a nice lot where it's pretty obvious that there are several lot lines, most opposite the front, and then there's two kind of very obvious sides. They come up basically perpendicular from the front property lines and are pretty much perpendicular to the rear property lines. What's less clear is when you have a lot that has multiple side property lines and when it should still be a side and when it should transition to a rear. And so basically what we've landed on as each one of these comes forward is this idea that sometimes with these multiple side property lines, they're almost parallel or they're parallel enough that they should be considered sides. Both of them should be considered sides rather than rears. And so what we're proposing with this amendment is to put in a very clear and objective threshold to say, if you've got two side property lines that are so parallel, meaning 130 degrees apart from it, angled away from each other up to obviously parallel, which is 180 degrees, then it's a side property line. And then we'd amend the existing figure in the definition to say, okay, if your if that property line is actually at a more, what's the opposite of, I've forgotten all my geometry, if it is even geometry, but if the two side property lines are closer together, if it's a tighter angle, meaning 130 degrees or less than 130 degrees, then it would be considered a rear. And again, that's not going to work 100% of the time. There'll still probably be a little bit of interpretation, but this one at least gives us a clear and objective threshold to start from so we can help get to a clearer understanding for people when they come into the counter. So just checking in on that one, this is going to be a little bit of extra language and another figure that's added to the definition of a regular lot. Any questions?
So Johanna, can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
So I imagine based on what I'm hearing, there's occasions when there can be more than one rear property.
Yes. Yes. And sometimes like the figure that you see in the table, it's okay because it's just sort of this broad rear setback and maybe there's multiple lines there, but it doesn't really impact the overall building envelope. But sometimes we see a rear that just really cuts into an allowed building envelope and makes it very difficult to build on that lot.
Okay, thank you.
So do I have the commission's support to move forward with this one?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Moving into the next two, again, this is where I want to consolidate the next two items. And again, this is very word heavy, but it's actually really basic. So hopefully I'll explain this in a way that doesn't create confusion. When we did the code streamlining and then the consolidation of the use standards and tables, that was not a perfect effort. There was a lot of different places from the code we had to pull things and consolidate things and deal with like similar but slightly different terms. And then we also have use specific standards that are tied to certain use types. In that effort, we accidentally applied a use specific standard to a broad use category, community institution. And then that use category was then changed to institutional uses. But set that aside, what happened inadvertently was that use specific standards that should have applied only to churches, convents, and related facilities got applied to all of the use types within the institutional use category. And so what we're doing is just dialing that back to where that use specific standard is only applicable to that very one specific use type. So hopefully that's clear. The second one deals with the residential use table. And somehow, again, in that code streamlining and consolidation effort, several use categories were accidentally dropped and several use types were accidentally dropped. So what this amendment will do was restore those allowed use categories and use types. We're going to add education back in as a use category. That's kind of the broader use category. And then under that, we're going to add educational institutions private back as a conditional use allowed in residential zones. And again, that's just restoring what is a long-standing conditionally allowed use in residential zones. You have the International Leadership Academy, you have Our Lady of the Lake. Those are similar private educational institutional uses that are allowed conditionally in residential zones. This amendment also adds in back in daycare center as a conditional use type. Under the daycare use category. So there's a daycare use category, but not a daycare center use type. So it's a weird little flub up there. And then finally, this amendment adds back in institutional use as, again, a use category with institutional use category with institutional use as a use type, again, conditionally in residential zones. So sorry, that came out clear in my head. Hopefully that's clear to the commission. Overall, the takeaway is we are just restoring allowed use categories and use types, longstanding use categories and use types back into the table that were inadvertently missed in previous code amendments. Are there any questions about that? Okay, so I have the commission's support to keep moving forward with that one.
It appears so.
Okay, great. So this next one, number 3, again, I'm going to consolidate it with number 2 because it again goes back to the commercial use tables. And that effort that we made to grab all of the community institutional uses and consolidate them under one use category. And
Excuse me, Joanna.
Yes.
Is there another slide you need to put up?
Oh,
Is
I
there
am so
number
sorry.
3?
Thank you. I got too many. I got 2 computers and like 3 documents here that I'm trying to. So please, yes, remind me that I haven't moved the slide forward. Okay. So this third item, again, I'm going to consolidate with item number 2 because it goes back to the commercial use table and the whole institutional use versus community institution. Unfortunately, one of the footnotes in the table still refers to community institution, and the correct term is institutional use. So that's just a quick change there. So hopefully that doesn't generate any questions, and I have the commission's support on that one.
Yes.
Okay, great. So the fourth one, the next 2 actually deal with the Downtown Redevelopment Design District, the DRDD. The first one, excuse me, my allergies mean I cough a lot. We have 2 tracks for development projects in the DRDD. The first is the discretionary track, and that is how it sounds. It's basically just our standard overlay with subjective language for development projects. And then we have the clear and objective track that was created a number of years ago. And when that was created, unfortunately, they weren't 100% the same, or at least over the years with code amendments, the applicability sections became a little bit different. So what we're proposing to do with this amendment is simply model the applicability section under the discretionary track and use that to fix the clear and objective track. And so we'd be adding back in substantial remodels as subject, able to use the clear and objective track if there's a development project that wants to do so. And then under the there are a number of R2 zone properties in the overlay. And under the discretionary track, there's a very limited set of overlay standards that they have to comply with. And so that is unfortunately not in the clear and objective track. So we're just going to copy and paste that language and put the same, or list out the same standards that apply in the discretionary track to the clear and objective track for these R2 zone properties. So it's basically allowing a little bit more flexibility under the clear and objective track for those, making them available for substantial remodels in R2 zone properties. Any questions about that?
Commissioners, if you have any questions or issues, please speak up.
Yeah, I do have one question, Johanna. What is the difference between, like, what makes a remodel a substantial remodel versus just,
I'm sorry, I'm struggling to deal with connecting to the internet. I knew somebody was going to ask me that question, but basically the substantial remodel, and I'm going to be trying to get back into the code here, unless Evan, Mr. Boone, if you're available. Substantial remodel depends on the type of project. It's defined a little bit differently for restaurants than it is for, say, a multifamily use. But there are actually very clear and objective thresholds where if you go over a certain change to an elevation or a certain number of square feet per restaurant, that it comes into play.
I'll get that in a minute.
So I'm gonna really quickly here. So substantial remodeling of an existing building for exterior remodeling that changes the appearance of more than 50% of any building elevation, or a restaurant building expansion of more than 100 square feet. And there are some exceptions to that. Like if it's designed only for accessibility, the restaurant expansion is designed only for accessibility, or if it's a seasonal restaurant enclosure. Does that answer your question, Commissioner Stewart?
It does. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So do I have the commission's support to move forward with this one?
I believe so. I don't hear it otherwise.
No objections. Okay, thank you. The next one deals with a specific code section in the overlay that is called storefront appearance standards. And
Do we need a
storefront-
new slide?
Yes, thank you. There we go. Storefront appearance is basically the retail appearance along the public street and on certain alleys. And so there are minimum sill heights, or maximum sill heights, I should say, minimum fenestration requirements, meaning so much of your building elevation on that ground floor needs to be dedicated to windows and doors. And what happened with the North Anchor project is that we were looking at the code and realized that when there are only a certain number of alleys that this storefront appearance standard applies to, and it's a specific 4-block area, and it's actually called the compact shopping district in the LOR urban design plan. And so to clarify that it's not every single alley within the overlay that has to comply with the storefront appearance standard on that elevation, the elevation facing the alley, we're going to add in a little bit of language and then the map from the urban design plan, just showing that kind of 4-block area. The other thing that this amendment does is it codifies a longstanding practice of exempting purely residential projects from compliance with the storefront appearance standards for logical reasons. This would apply to single-family homes, which don't happen in the overlay all that often, but middle housing, and then to multifamily. So if they have a frontage on a sidewalk, or possibly even a frontage on one of those few alleys, they don't have to put in some sort of fake retail storefront appearance there. So again, it just codifies a longstanding practice. Are there any questions about that? And do I have the commission's support?
Only makes sense.
Okay. So next is item 6. I'm on the right slide. And the next 3 actually deal with height. And I'm sure some of you have experience with how height is dealt with, especially for residential zones. It can be a little complicated. And so these amendments are there. They've come up again because we've come across building permits or counter questions where people have shown us that the code needs to be modified or simplified or clarified. So these next 3 amendments hopefully will do that. So the first one deals with lot coverage and how you figure out how much lot coverage you get for a residentially zoned lot. And if you look at the residential zone dimensional tables for lot coverage, it's a sliding scale. Basically, the taller the building, the taller your house is, the smaller the footprint. So if you want, say, a 28-foot tall house, you get 25% lot coverage. But if you're willing to look at, say, a single-story house, then you could get up to 35% lot coverage. In the R6 zone, it's actually 35% and 45%. So lot coverage is very much determined by the height of your home. What we've seen, though, is some confusion about how to measure that height and then determine your maximum lot coverage. We've had some pushback with people saying, oh, well, this code also allows a 6-foot peekaboo for roof forms. So I just want you to ignore the top 6 feet of my house. And yes, so it's a 28-foot house, but really it's a 22-foot house because I want you to ignore the top 6 feet of it. That means I get 35% lot coverage rather than 25% lot coverage. And there's no way. We were trying to come up with ways to clarify in the code how that's not right. And it's just a misunderstanding. But what we want to do with this is basically build in a reference to lot coverage where we just point to the code, to the definition of building height, which has some figures and fairly clear language on how you measure height, actual height of the building. And then from there, we have supplemental handouts that we've been developing and refining over the years to help explain that whole relationship between lot coverage and height. So hopefully this amendment will keep people from going down rabbit holes and asking us to ignore portions of their height of their structure and just help make the implementation process a little bit easier. So hopefully there's no questions from the commission, and I have your support to move forward on this one.
Commissioners, any questions or comments? I see none. I suppose then it is acceptable.
Great, thank you. The next one
New
deals
slide.
Oh, thank you. The next one deals with just a bad term, the wrong term that's incorporated into the zone dimensional tables. We have what we call a sloped lot height, meaning there is within your building footprint, there is a 10-foot change in elevation or more. And when you have that situation, you have a big grade change, either from side to side, front to back, however, or a lot of times diagonally across, which is always fun. But you do get more height in that scenario. Unfortunately, all of the tables call it a sloped lot, where the correct term as defined by our code is footprint sloped. So this would just go back through and correct the term to be the one that's actually defined. And I also noticed a couple of other areas where the code is inconsistent, but they're small little changes, not sloping topography, but lot with sloping topography, things like that. So this is just clarifying the code to use the correct terms. Hopefully no questions with that one.
Looks good.
Okie doke, thank you. Next slide. Oops, nope. Okay, the last one is lot with sloping topography. What we have is a flat lot slope or flat lot height, and that is a lot that doesn't have any change in topography within the building envelope. And then we have the sloped lot, where there's that 10-foot change within the building footprint. In between, a few years ago, we created kind of a medium called a lot with sloping topography. And that was an effort to basically give a little bit of flexibility when you have a 1 to 4 foot slope change across your building footprint. And it came about because a couple of homes in the first edition were built where they graded the site to flatten out the building envelope and then built their structure from there. And it ended up looking like the homes were built in a hole. And they just kind of artificially lowered the grade and then built up from there. So this height methodology was created to kind of be flexible on the back end of a sloped area, like a medium sloped area. So you have a height that's held at one point, say 28 feet. And then as the topography changes and drops down up to 4 feet, we just ignore that change in topography. And it's complicated and hard to discuss without visuals. But basically, the legislative intent of this code amendment was clear. Unfortunately, the code implementing it was written in such a way that there's a little bit of flexibility there, or a little bit of room for interpretation, and we've gotten some pushback on a couple of projects. So really what this amendment will do was make sure that the code implementing this, this height methodology is clear, consistent with the legislative intent, and codifies our longstanding practice, which is to avoid homes being built on hills or in wells or holes. And again, I know height is a little complicated, but hopefully it's understood that this is just clarifying the code, not changing anything. Any questions about that?
Commissioners? Hearing nothing, I suppose it's just okay.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to assume unless told differently. Okay, so number 9, to staff's surprise, when we read the fence code, or I should say the city attorney's office read the fence code very clearly when looking at a specific project, we realized that the fence code treats fences and walls differently from retaining walls when you use them or when you build them in combination. Basically, we figured out that within 10 feet of a public right-of-way, you're not allowed to have a fence on top of a retaining wall. That's not permitted, even though we have allowed it in the past, thinking that that was allowed, because you could have a fence, say a wood slat fence on top of a concrete wall. But if it's retaining, if that wall is retaining something, meaning there's some sort of surcharge against it, that's not allowed within that the first 10 feet of the property abutting the right of way. So this amendment would basically clarify that you could have a fence, a wall, or a retaining wall, or any sort of combination thereof within 10 feet of the public right of way, subject to just the standard fence height maximums. It would also bring a little bit of flexibility to the minor variance standard, where you could get some exceptions to those heights of either the fence, wall, or retaining wall, or a combination thereof, as long as you comply with the minor variance criteria. So basically, again, this just sort of codifies a longstanding practice of staff to allow these combinations and to also allow minor variances to these combinations subject to the variance criteria. So hopefully that's clear. And I'm open to any questions from the commission.
I have a question.
Commissioner Phillips.
Thank you.
I heard you say that you've allowed something in the past, but now are you saying it's not going to be allowed? Did I hear that correctly?
Correct. Once we got an interpretation for the city attorney's office that, excuse me, that actually the code does not allow a fence on top of retaining a wall within 10 feet of a public right of way. We've had to tell people no on that. And so we'd like to get back to our longstanding practice because we have not seen any issues with allowing that sort of combination.
So the
Okay,
amendment
the only
would
comment
allow-
I'll make there is people and homeowners, people in general like consistency. So it seems, I would be a bit upset if I was a homeowner and was asking to do this and it had been allowed before, but now it won't be allowed. That's not consistent.
Exactly. That's why we do these annual code amendments. So when we do find some sort of snag in the code that keeps us from doing what is common sense or what we've been doing by practice because of a misinterpretation of the code or not understanding how the code has changed, we like to go back and revisit it and make sure that we can do our consistent practice.
So Johanna, this restores consistency. Bottom line is
Exactly.
it restores the way you have been interpreting it.
So it is allowing combination wall, retaining wall and fences within 10 feet of the right of way.
Exactly.
What is the maximum height that can be?
It can be 4 feet. That's what's allowed by code. When you're within 10 feet of a public right of way, we have sight distance issues as far as like people coming out of driveways, possible conflicts with pedestrians. So you have a maximum height of 4 feet. Again,
Total?
4 feet total. Yeah,
Retaining wall and fence.
exactly. But then if you have some sort of unique scenario, which again, we've seen, we do allow minor variances to fences and retaining walls and walls. So this would allow a minor variance to the combination as well.
Thank you.
Subject to compliance with the variance criteria, which include, safety, public safety issues like sight distance on driveways.
Right. Thank you. Anyone else? I guess that one has been explained then.
Okay, thank you. The next one deals with what we call a unified site. So on a lot of larger projects, commercial projects, school projects, even city projects, a project area or development project area is a lot of times made up of underlying lots of record, 2, 3, 4, sometimes even more lots of record. And what we do is we have this unified site where we say, okay, we're not going to look at these individual lots and try to implement our development codes on the individual lots of record. We're going to look at it as a unified site. And oddly enough, parking is not one of the things we look at for a unified site. That the word parking is missing. And it doesn't make sense at all to look at parking on individual lots, especially when we have development projects, even structures crossing those underlying lots of record. So what this amendment would do was simply add parking in there and make it clear that we look at it based on the unified site, not those individual lots.
Makes sense.
Okay, so I'm going to move forward with that one. Number 11, this comes from, I believe, the engineering team. When we have a development project that increases intensity of use or adds more trips, a certain level of trips to a system, a lot of times we require public improvements. That could be a new street or a widening of a street, putting in a sidewalk or widening or continuing a sidewalk, And when we approve these projects, we have phased conditions of approval. And typically on, say, like a subdivision, we require that those public improvements, the new street and the sidewalks, the public utilities, be put in either constructed or bonded before we allow an applicant to file their subdivision plat at the county and create the new lots of record to build on. The code in here isn't very clear. And so the city attorney's office, working with the city engineer, realized that we needed to clarify this code and make sure that we are codifying our long-standing practice of requiring either that construction or bonding early in the process. So we don't have a situation where someone gets approval of a subdivision, walks away in the middle of it, and then somebody else inherits this I don't want to call it a mess, but maybe a bit of a confusing situation where some of the improvements have been reviewed, possibly constructed, and some haven't. So we want to make sure that we have the ability to either force to require an applicant to construct or bond early in the process. And this just codifies, again, a longstanding practice. And I don't know if Deputy Attorney Boone has any more to add to that one. Okay.
Unless the commission has questions.
Any questions about that?
I would just add that this is how every other local jurisdiction in the world that I know of does it. So
consistent with our practice,
we're not just
consistent with the rest of the world.
Not just codifying our practice, we're codifying the practice.
Yeah. And again, I think the code gets there, but it could be clarified to better reflect this practice. Okay, moving on. Thank you. Moving on to number 12. This is again, just sort of coming from the engineering department. They noticed that we used an outdated term when referring to certain professionals. There are two standards, the weak foundation soil standard and the hillside protection standard. They have an outdated reference. And so this is just going through and substituting registered geotechnical engineer as the type of engineer that can perform the analyses for these specific reports. So very basic.
Makes sense.
Thank you. So number 13 is also very basic. There's absolutely no change in the language. We're just relocating it. So right now, the city recorder sends a notice of a legislative decision to everyone who has standing. So that's someone who's provided public testimony or an applicant or an appellant to that decision. But they are also required to send the notice of decision to anyone who requests it. Unfortunately, that little code section that tells the city recorder to send the notice of decision to anyone who requests it is buried in the wrong section. So we're just cutting it from there and putting it up in a more logical location. So no change in code.
Cut and paste.
Yes. And that will help us avoid an inadvertent error there. Okay. So moving on to number 14, again, an engineering issue. This is regarding utilities, specifically public utilities, and when an applicant will be required to underground those public utilities along a frontage. Of course, the goal of the city is to ensure that both private and public utilities are undergrounded as much as possible. Sometimes it's not feasible, and there are some exceptions there. But the engineering department wants us to look at the language in our community development code and make sure that we've got a little bit more clarity on 3 issues. The first one is that when a site has frontage, we're not just looking at one side of the street, we're looking at both sides of the street in front of that development. And that's because sometimes public utilities cross diagonally over a street. And so we want to be able to take a full look at what undergrounding means for that project's frontage. The second one is clarifying when that code section refers to land division, we're talking about any type of land division, be it residential or commercial zones. It's not very often that we see commercial land divisions, but they do happen occasionally, and we want to make sure that we can capture undergrounding, at least the analysis of potentially undergrounding when we have commercial land divisions. The third portion of this amendment clarifies for residential land divisions that it applies to both minor partitions, or I should just say partitions, which create 3 lots or less, and also subdivisions, which create 4 lots or less. So again, some text amendments there that help clarify when the city can analyze and then require undergrounding of public utilities in the public right of way. Any questions about that?
Sorry, subdivisions. I know you meant 4 or more, not 4 or less.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, subdivision. Partitions create 3 or fewer lots, and subdivisions create 4 or more lots.
So this hasn't been instituted before, or how is this being clarified now and not in the past?
I think that the city engineer, the code grants, when we're looking at right-of-way improvements, the LOC Chapter 42 grants the city engineer quite a bit of authority. And we haven't really run across any issues where someone has challenged that authority. I mean, I think it happens occasionally, but we're able to work through it. They just want to make sure that LOC Chapter 42 and the CDC, that's LOC Chapter 50, grant the city engineer similar authority when we're looking at this. And so it's really kind of making sure that the scope and the terms and the authority are consistent between the two.
Thank you. Commissioners, any questions or comments? Seeing none, I think we can live with that.
Okay, thank you. Number 15 is pretty simple. We're just going to go through and make sure that we're using gender neutral pronouns within the entire CDC. And this is where, unfortunately, the draft amendments coming at you, this is we're going to be adding quite a few sections of the code where we just want to take out any gendered pronouns and insert gender neutral, but it's a very basic fix there. Hopefully no questions about that.
Nope.
Great, thank you. Number 16, again, the city engineer noticed that we use the term private streets in LOC Chapter 50. We don't have private streets. We have public streets, we have alleys, we have private access lanes, we have driveways, but we don't have any private streets. So their request was to please remove that phrase from, looks like 5 or 6 different standards where that term comes up, and make sure that we're consistent, again, between the various code chapters. Any questions about that?
Commissioner Rigby?
Would it be impossible for someone to build a private street in the future?
Basically, when you say a private street, the only way that you can have sort of a private lane serving lots is when you have a minor partition and you're limited to 3 or fewer lots on that private access lane. So we already have a phrase that covers that eventuality or that scenario. After 3 new lots, then you have to put in a public street. So basically private street is a moot point. We already have private access lane or just access lane. That is the same thing.
I see. So it's semantic.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Johanna?
Go ahead.
Now, I did the legislative research, and private street used to mean way back like pre-1980 or so. It was private streets within a gated subdivision.
Right.
Oh, okay.
And we don't allow any gated subdivisions anymore. Basically, we have more than 3 properties that are served. You have to, that's as far as you go. So that's a partition. So you don't even have. So what it was intended to be doesn't exist anymore. It's not allowed.
Commissioner, Deputy Boone, does that mean places like Taylor's Crest, which is a graded community, are those grandfathered as private streets, or are they public streets now?
Well, these terms are applied to the creation of.
Okay.
When somebody's applying for development, so they're not.
They don't go back.
They don't go back.
Okay.
But they can't go forward.
We do have some longer private access lanes that serve more than 3 lots, and those are remnants from previous code iterations.
Right.
But we don't require them to go public. A lot of times they couldn't meet the public street widths, and so they're just sort of grandfathered in like.
Right, if they can't put a gate on them, the fire department has issues about that.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you.
So number 17, Something that's kind of unique with City of Lake Oswego is that we regulate garages and carports the same. A lot of jurisdictions don't even regulate garages. We do, and we also consider carports the same as a garage for the implementation of a few standards. One is how we measure floor area, and the second is how we measure accessory structure size purposes, so like a detached accessory structure. So carports, obviously, they don't have walls, and so people have been confused in the past on how to measure the size of the carport. And so this code amendment would simply clarify that when you're looking at a carport, assuming a little bit of overhang for the roof structure, but we would measure the area of the carport from the porch supports, assuming 4.4 support columns and maybe a little bit of eave overhang. We draw a box around the support columns and consider that the size of the carport. Any questions about that?
Makes sense. Commissioners?
Yes, I do have I have a question real quick.
Of course.
Just about a carport, because I think there are a number of these around that actually have like a rear wall. So I guess the question is, I mean, could we say that a carport is an enclosure, is something that's not fully enclosed in condition like a garage?
Yeah.
I see a number of carports that actually do in fact have a wall, but
or
it's
a partial, like just a step wall or something like that. Yeah, there's a whole kind of spectrum of carports. They could be attached to one side of a structure or within kind of an L of a structure. Basically, if it's not fully enclosed, we consider it a carport and we treat it the same as a garage.
Yeah, I think you could say that a carport is just something where air can blow through it easily.
Exactly.
And
regardless whether there are 4 support columns or 2, this definition or this amendment would clarify how to measure it. So if it was up against a building wall, then we would go from the building wall and draw a square capturing around the 2 standalone support columns.
Got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. So finally, number 18, the definition of group care home includes some ableist language, which is potentially offensive. So we're going to fix that. And that is it for number 18, pretty straightforward. Any questions about that?
Commissioners, any questions? Seeing none, I think that's fine.
All right. Well, we are trucking through these. Thank you so much. Now we're getting into the policy amendments, and I found this picture of the new City Hall online. I think it was in the OTAC website, and I thought it was a really attractive photo. It really kind of highlights the architectural style of the new City Hall, so I thought I'd share that with everyone. So again, the policy amendments are ones that require a little bit more discussion and some definite feedback and assistance from the Commission on ways to tailor it, whether or not we should move forward with it, if staff is going in the right direction. I'm not sure where I was going with that sentence. So, but there are 7 of them right now. And that may change based on what we hear from the Commission tonight or ongoing work with staff. The first one deals with the general building design standards, and that's LOC 50.06.001. And on a part of that standard says if you're building a structure, it needs to be within 30 feet of a street, and you need a public entrance leading directly from the public sidewalk or the street to the structure. And that's fine when you have a development going in on a block, say in downtown or along Boone's Ferry Road. You want to have the building up close to the street. Where it comes to be a potential problem or kind of an ongoing problem is with larger sites for schools, for city projects, major public facilities, where we have a more typical site plan where there is circulation, vehicular circulation for buses, for drop off, for parking up between the public street and the school or the facility. So what we've seen over the years is these projects have to incorporate a major variance to the standard in order to keep that more typical pedestrian or vehicular circulation pattern. And that is an additional fee, and it's not an insubstantial fee. And it also adds a certain level of uncertainty to a project because, in order to get that site plan, that more typical site plan, you also have to get approval of that major variance request, and the major variance threshold, the criteria, there's a pretty high bar that you have to meet there. In any case, again, what we've seen is just sort of incorporation of major variances into these projects. And so what we thought, looking at the code right now, structures and parks that are zoned parks and natural areas are automatically exempt from that standard. So the new swim center down off of Stafford did not have to comply with that standard. They didn't have to request a major variance either. So when we're taking a look at these type of projects, almost always it's a conditional use in whatever zone. And the conditional use standards, we have general conditional use standards. We also have use specific standards. A lot of times the use specific of criteria there that deal with circulation and good site planning. And then the general conditional use standards talk about mitigating impact on the neighborhood around it, helping it blend in as much as possible, and also making sure that the site is capable of supporting that use. So we already have a process where we ensure good site design and mitigate impacts. This burden, the building design burden to bring that building closer to the street, and the conflict that we just sort of keep coming back around on it, seems unnecessary. And so our thought was to consider exempting all structures in the public functions and P&A zones from compliance with this standard, similar to, like I said, how structures in the P&A parks are now exempt. So I wanted to open that up to the commission for discussion and see if there were any pitfalls to that, or if there are ways to change it or limit it, or if you were comfortable with it as we have it kind of explained here.
Just as a caution, of course, the purpose of this is a study session, so it's not to decide the ultimate issue, but to identify the issues to bring forward ultimately, perhaps in a public hearing. So it's issue spotting, but not to deliberate.
Thank you, Deputy Boone. Commissioner Rigsby?
Could you go over a little bit what kinds of buildings are considered public facilities besides schools?
Sure. The actually major public facilities, I'm going to the definitions now on the code, so I'm going to read some things to you. But they include everything from bathrooms in public parks to the city hall to schools, things like that. Sorry, I'm just scrolling here. Okay, so the wastewater treatment plant, utility substations, reservoirs, fire station, parks, libraries, schools, community centers, police station, administrative buildings, all of those would be included in are subject to this standard as it's currently written.
So in most cases,
except for structures in parks, sorry.
So in most cases, this has been a matter of the city requesting a variance from itself?
Yes, it is. Not, I mean, it's most of the time, looking back, I know it's come up with school projects, but again, those are schools, public monies, and typically what you see in schools, not just in Lake Oswego, but all over, is you have parking for students and staff up front, and you have bus drop-offs, and you have, school kid drop-off areas. Not, and to narrow it to 30 feet is really atypical and complicated. And as is the major variance, getting a little bit of flexibility there. So again, it was just one of those things where I started looking at and I thought, well, this actually came up on, I don't think it was my project. It was another planner's project, I think for the River Grove Elementary School. But I was looking at it and I thought, does it make sense to require this compliance with this standard when we keep bumping up against it? Is there an opportunity to evaluate it, see if
I have a question.
Yes.
Commissioner Stewart had his hand up next.
Yeah, I would support this idea for I think most of the city though, but I wonder if it's appropriate in like the downtown or the old town area, because I know there's not a lot of public function or PNA zones in those two areas, but like the library site, the city hall site, which I guess is not relevant since it's already just been built, but some of these other sort of closer to downtown type sites, I would personally like to see the building still be within 30 feet of the street, or required it to be, just because I think that's more appropriate for those two areas. So I was wondering, have you guys had any internal discussions about that sort of thing?
No, and honestly, it's exactly because of where those facilities are located. When they're in the downtown or old town area, those are a gridded system, usually more constrained lots. And so you have the logical building on one side of the property, parking either underneath or on the other side. So compliance isn't as much of an issue. I think it's the larger lots, a lot of times the school properties that are really, really large, multiple acres, that this comes into play more.
Sure. Okay.
There was someone else who had a question, Commissioner.
I have a question, Phillips.
Yes, thank you, Don.
Okay, so schools and major public facilities, I need a little bit of a history lesson here, I believe. Schools and major public facilities have been around since towns have been in existence. So some bright people wrote that code at some point. So what's changed? What's the history here? Why all of a sudden is this a problem when somebody thought it was a great idea at some point?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. A lot of these school facilities in particular have been in their current locations for decades, sometimes even a couple of generations. And what happened is that they were built under a much more flexible code. And then as the code changed, got updated, revised, more and more regulations got applied to them, even though they were kind of a different animal than, say, City Hall in a downtown area, or a mixed use project in a downtown area, or along Boone's Ferry Road. The code that got adopted was broader than maybe it should have been. It didn't cover all eventualities. And so there is the major variance out to that, the relief valve on that one, if you will. But again, because we have these schools, just to continue with that example, that have been in the same location for decades or generations. And then they're coming back through these bonds and wanting to update, remodel, tear down, and put up a new school, and they keep bumping up against the standard. That's when it becomes kind of like, wait, there's no common sense to this. And that's why this amendment is before you, because we do see that code has a different impact when you're looking at those long-standing sites.
Okay, so times change, is basically what you're saying.
Basically, that was my long-winded answer. Times changed.
Okay.
I think it's a very smart revision to the code, because it gives you more latitude without having to go through all that thought or all of the major variants.
Well, I think it goes back to, form following function. And, if the function is to have a walkable, approachable storefront lined downtown, then having storefront design and buildings that are placed at or near the street is really essential to that. And you're talking about larger campus style development, schools, public facilities, public works operation yards, things like that. The function is not to have a walkable, well, you'd like it to be as walkable as possible, but it's not a storefront environment. It's not, it's not a place where you're really trying to foster that kind of
window
activity.
shopping.
Yeah, so it's more important actually to have access for vehicles, pick up, drop off, school buses and whatnot. Doesn't mean you're compromising pedestrian access and safety. We have other standards that assure that. So yeah, it's not that there was a need for the standard, and we found over time that it's no longer serving a purpose. It's more about one size does not fit all, and ordinances, even the best ordinances are not going to address every development scenario. So I think this is a refinement, is what I view it as.
Good government.
Agreed. So is this something that the commission would be comfortable with staff moving forward, kind of fleshing this out a little bit? The exemption itself, the language would be very easy to do. The impacts of it, what I'd like to do is maybe bring a couple of projects to reference a couple of projects where they had to apply for a major variance, for major public facilities or schools. And so I can add in at the next work session, I can add in some images just to kind of show what it ended up looking like with the approved major variance to that standard.
Okay, commissioners, do you approve with her moving forward in that vein? Anybody opposed to it? Looks as though we're good with you moving forward and giving us some examples and codifying this.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, the second one, we had an attempt to standardize that backfired, this is kind of a frustrating one. We get a lot of requests for property owners wanting to put in heat pumps, AC units, generators, and we would have to do some deep research, figure out which zone they were in, and figure out, like, you know, from a 1979 plan development subdivision, what the setbacks were. So we just said, look, it's easier if we just have standard side and rear yard setbacks for these type of accessory units, noise producing accessory units. We have a 5-foot side and a 10-foot rear that applies across the city. We can just streamline this, make it easier for everyone, for the public and for staff to issue these permits. The part of this that unintentionally created a problem is the section that says notwithstanding side and rear yard setbacks of the zone. What we discovered is that there are some zones that have 0 or very small setbacks. For instance, the RW zone doesn't have any setbacks. And so a lot of homes, it's a very limited area of the city that's zoned RW, but a lot of these homes are built front to or side to side or front to rear. There's literally no place to locate these noise producing units in a way that complies with the standard 5-foot side and 10-foot rear. So we want to dial it back a little bit and consider amending the code to either allow those standard 5 or 10-foot setbacks or the underlining zones, whichever is less. So instead of notwithstanding the side and rear yard setbacks of the zone, saying, okay, these are your standards, but if your zone is less, you can use those. Any questions about that?
Commissioner Phillips?
I need some clarification more than, I think what you're saying is you're going to find a way for any homeowner that wants a heat pump, which apparently is environmentally friendly, as well as AC units, regardless of their setbacks, there's going to be a way to get it done. Did I hear you correctly on that?
We're trying to, the original code amendment that standardized the setbacks helped us get those permits done quicker without a lot of back and forth. But they don't work 100% of the time with those particular zones that have 0 setbacks. So we are trying to recapture those zones that have lesser, like setbacks that are smaller than 5-foot sides and 10-foot rears, and still allow them to place the units on the property, assuming that they have it, that they're not like 100% built out to all property lines, which doesn't happen very often. But it just, for those particular kind of rare scenarios, we do have a little bit of flexibility in the code so they can still put those units on their property.
Okay, I hope that you find a way to do that, because AC units in this area are becoming obvious. I just moved here, but you know, it sounds like and looks like the weather's going to require that people are going to need AC units, and heat pumps are environmentally friendly. So I hope you can find a way that everybody can have this without putting in central air.
No,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you know, there are a lot of different types of AC installations. I mean, there are the units that sit in the side yard that you're most familiar with. You know, there are units that can actually, well, you know, window units, and units that can be installed on a rooftop if it's if it lends itself to that. So it may not be possible. It's likely it's not going to be possible in every lot to get an AC unit or a heat pump in a side yard, even with these unified setbacks that Johanna's proposing. But there are other types of AC units that one can install. So just wanted to say, we're not assuring that everyone gets an AC unit, in their side yard between their house and the neighbor's house. There may not always be space for that.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. That's I should say Community Development Director Siegel. That's a very good point. This just kind of unwinds this regulation a little bit, but yeah, you're absolutely right. It doesn't guarantee that everyone's going to find a place to put it in their yard. They might have to look at in a garage or in a window or on a roof or on an existing patio or something like that.
Commissioner Heap, did you have a question?
Yeah, my question was, if this goes to a public hearing, would it make sense to just be very clear about what this means? Actually, kind of following on to what Director Siegel, I think, was touching on a little bit. But when I look at it, I kind of wonder, does it mean that, if you have a 5-foot or a 10-foot setback, that you can put the heat pump or air conditioning unit anywhere in that 5-foot or 10-foot side yard setback?
No.
Or does it mean that it has to go from the edge of you got to have 5 feet of setback from the end of the unit over to the property line?
It's the second. So
Yeah.
Looking at the outside of a unit, as far as its proximity to a property line, the outside edge of the unit has to be at least 5 feet from a side property line and at least 10 feet from a rear property line. And as you know, there are a number of zones that have 5-foot sides. And so you couldn't put the AC unit on that side, in that side yard setback. You'd have to find another place on the property to put it. And that's fine. A lot of times you have rear yard setbacks that are plenty generous enough to locate a unit like that. It's when you have a dwelling or structure that's all the way at the side property lines on a smaller lot that it becomes a little bit more complicated. So, I mean, it sounds like we're opening it back up again. But really, we're just trying to add back in a little bit of flexibility in certain scenarios.
I would just say, if we go to a hearing, we should be clear on what exactly it means. Like, when you define it to be the ladder from the edge to the lot line, just make sure that that's clear as it comes out in the hearing.
I concur.
Just a moment, I'm going to take notes here.
Commissioner Heap, you want to put your hand down? Commissioner Mitchell, did you have a question or a comment?
Yes, I just wanted, Johanna, do you know why the legislative history behind why the notwithstanding was put in the code to begin with? Because it seems like what we essentially might be doing is overturning that. So I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think that amendment came in 2019. I wasn't in charge of that. But the issue, I remember the pain of being the planner on duty and having someone come in with a mechanical permit for an AC unit, and how I'd have to drop everything and dig deep into the records and try to figure out what the setbacks were for an accessory structure in that particular zone, in that particular subdivision that was approved, say 20 years ago. Our records are okay, but they're not great, and it does take a lot of time. And so the point was to figure out, like, what's a logical standardized setback for these types of units, and just apply it citywide. So staff could have, like, basically try to process these permits a lot quicker, help building the building department out, and help the planner on duty out, just to get these turned around. But the notwithstanding the side and rear yard setbacks, it looks like Deputy City Attorney Boone, you might have a little bit of clarity on that one.
Well, if you don't have that language, then these are structures which would have to meet the accessory structure standards, which may be more than 5-foot side and 10-foot rear. So this allows them to be placed up to the 5-foot side and 10-foot rear. The problem in this case is, well, what if the code doesn't restrict accessory structures or primary structures unless you go to the lot line? Should the heat pumps and AC units then be required to go, or would they be permitted to go to the lot line, or should they still have a 5-foot side and 10-foot rear because of the noise issue. You know, that's the policy question. And I think staff's recommendation is, given the noise impacts, we just go with the uniform, because the noise impacts are kind of uniform. Go with essentially a buffer for these heat pumps and AC units. So it's a uniform 5-foot side and rear, 10-foot rear.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask one last question? We keep talking about accessory units. What about ADUs? How would these setbacks apply to a second AC unit on an ADU?
Thank you. That's a good question. So the setbacks regulating this type of noise producing accessory units is actually in its own kind of subsection. And it calls out specifically residential heat pumps, air conditioners, or similar noise producing mechanical equipment. And it doesn't matter what unit it's associated with. It just has those standardized setbacks. So if you had a primary structure on a site and also an accessory dwelling unit, if both of them had separate air conditioning units, both units of the air conditioning units would have to meet the standardized setbacks right now.
Thank you. I guess we have given you input on that. Does that help you?
Yes, thanks. I will take into consideration the language, make sure that it's clear on how to measure that. I'll look to staff to see if they have any suggestions on language that could be added either to this subsection where it regulates setbacks or to another subsection if it's more logical there, but I'll look into that. Thank you. Okay, so the third one deals with patios. Right now, there is a code section called exceptions, projections, and encroachments, and that's 50.04.003. And under that, there is a specific 3-foot setback that is enforced for patios. And there's a 3-foot setback off a side and rear property line for a patio. What the city attorney's office realized is that setbacks only apply to structures, something that obstructs from ground to sky. Because a patio is at grade, it's built on grade, it doesn't technically, is not technically a structure, and therefore we can't enforce a setback. And so we've been digging around in the standard, trying to figure out a way to reword it, reorganize it, so that we can maintain what I'm now kind of calling in the meantime, and sorry, my cat's yelling at me, just a minute, I have to let him out. Beast. We live by their whims. So what we're trying to do is figure out a way to word this so we can maintain that 3-foot separation or offset, if you will, from the property lines, because it is important for people to be able to construct and install these sort of patios and maintain them without having to trespass on a neighbor's property or ask for permission to get on their property. And it's also important for stormwater runoff. If at grade impervious area goes right to a property line, there's no opportunity to manage the stormwater runoff before it goes onto the neighbor's property. So again, the code language is a little, I've been working with the Deputy City Attorney Boone to try and figure out the right way to word it. But the point is we want to continue this longstanding practice that we've had to, and as it's written in code, but technically not legal, we want to just make sure that we're maintaining this practice and figuring out a way to do that clearly. The other part of that is when we were looking at it, we realized that the Oswego Lake Development Table doesn't reference patios. It allows decks within the Oswego Lake 25-foot setback area, but it doesn't talk about patios. And I'm pretty sure if you took a tour of the lake, you'd be hard pressed to find a property on the lake that didn't have a patio down there in that area. So what we'd want to do is figure out a way to keep this patio offset from property lines, and then also just add in that patios are allowed similar to decks in the Oswego Lake setback. So, and like I said at the beginning of this, we have been tossing around some code language. I didn't put it before you because we haven't like formally vetted that, but I will be bringing it to the work session. But I wanted to check in with the commission to see if this direction made sense, or if you had any suggestions on ways to go with that.
I have a thought, and that is sometimes it's not just a patio that is within 3 feet or right up to a property line. It could be a tennis court or a pickleball court or any impervious surface. So maybe you shouldn't limit the verbiage to the term patio.
I think that sports courts are actually regulated in a separate section.
Okay.
So let me, patios and decks. That's such a good question. I wish I worked at the counter more sometimes, because these are.
Well,
a
you can
lot
get
of-
back to us on that. It's
Yeah.
not a deal breaker. It's just a thought. Anyone
Yeah.
else, commissioners?
Yeah, we can take a look at that because there are other provisions that relate to pathways and driveway surfaces, other paved
Exactly.
surfaces.
Walkways, everything. Mhm.
I don't
Okay.
see any other commissioners raising their hands to make a comment.
Okay, so I'll continue working on this, and we can talk about this more at the next work session, make sure we're on the right path there.
Thank you.
Okay, so the fourth item, as you are aware, the Lake Grove Business Association, in cooperation with business owners and neighborhood activists over in the Lake Grove and West Lake Grove area, we're looking at the 2 overlay sections to see, I'm kind of taking a broad look at it to see if there are ways to streamline or ensure that the 2 overlays were consistent when it came to building design, street furniture, things like that. Ways to make those codes, like I said, more consistent, maybe a little bit more sustainable. That progress, we haven't seen progress over the last 4 or 5 months with that. But we wanted to take an opportunity to move just a small portion of that forward. And that deals with exterior cladding. Right now, the architectural styles that are allowed in both of those overlays. Wood is sometimes a really good exterior cladding that helps create that architectural design. Right now, in both overlays, you have to use real wood, painted or stained, it doesn't matter, but you have to use real wood. You can't use composite or engineered wood. And that's understandable from like 15 or 20 years ago. The products that were composite or engineered were not great. There's been vast improvements, though, in the appearance and the longevity and the sustainability of these materials. When you have painted, say, fiber cement cedar shakes, they really do look very similar to a real wood cedar shake. But like I said, they are a lot more durable. They're more resistant to pests. Sometimes they're even more fire resistant. So what we wanted to look at was modifying the allowed exterior materials in both of these overlays to make it possible to use real wood, of course, if people want to, but then also engineered or composite wood. And it'd just be modifying the allowed or prohibited materials list in both of those. We'd also be looking at writing up using some common definitions for both of those. So there's a little bit of clarity when people ask about that. So again, this was just sort of moving forward a small portion of that broader effort because we are seeing more redevelopment in the West Lake Grove area and also in the Lake Grove Village Center area as well.
Thank you. Commissioner Mitchell, you have a question?
Yes,
Comment?
Johanna, are there any downsides to engineered or composite wood? Like what are if somebody were to argue against it, what would they say?
Well, I think I'm not sure how to phrase this in a way that doesn't sound problematic, but I think there's a resistance against what people perceive as fake products. And I think that even 15, 20 years ago, my own house was resided in fiber cement. And it had that kind of stamped wood pattern on it, and it looked pretty cheap. That was from, I think, 1990, early 2000s or something like that. So when I got it resided, I went with fiber cement again, but I went with a smooth, and it has a really nice texture to it. So I think the holdout there and the reason that they are prohibited is both of those overlays were developed in the mid 90s or mid 2000s. And there was that holdout there from like the what was perceived as lower quality in durability and in appearance. But those products have improved vastly over the last 10, 15 years.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Rigsby, you had a question?
Yes, I wonder if something maybe like some sort of community outreach would be prudent in this kind of circumstance. I imagine that the motivation behind that was, you know, a desire for authenticity and
Yes.
quality, and you know, maybe even for sort of a slower pace of development in the Lake Grove area. And you know, I know in comparison to sort of the direction people have wanted that area to take versus the direction that sort of the downtown core has taken, you know, I think people would, you know, the neighborhoods around there would probably have strong opinions on, you know, whether they perceive that as affecting the, you know, the quality and feel of the, you know, of that town center.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. And I don't think that we would have brought this forward as its own kind of, as part of the annual code amendments, if that discussion hadn't already started happening with the neighborhood associations, the very active community members, business owners, and the Lake Grove Business Association over on the west side of town. So that conversation has been happening. I know Scott Siegel, Director Siegel, sent an email to Ken Sandblast, who is works with the Lake Grove Business Association. He's kind of spearheading that discussion over there to take a look at those two overlays. Scott, did you ever hear back from Ken Sandblast on that one?
Not yet, but this is something that it will not come as a surprise to that group, and obviously we'll be continuing our conversations with them, you know, before this goes to a public hearing, because the last thing that any of you or we want is a surprise. So yeah, I don't think that this is something that is, you know,
Would it be contentious?
No, I don't think so. I mean,
No.
you know, we'll continue to check in with them, and I think that they've just had other, you know, other higher priorities on their plate. And frankly, we've given them going on 2 years to actually, you know, digest this, or at least over a year to digest it. And so, you know, on some level, we feel a responsibility to bring forward improvements in our process, in our code, and in alignment with city council goals for sustainability and housing. And so that's part of the background for this as well. But, you know, I'll let you know when I hear from Ken, and I would hope that, you know, they would be supportive. And I said that much to him. I said that I hope that, you know, you'd be supportive of the city moving forward, at least on this narrower scope, while we continue to explore a broader agenda.
Thank you, Scott. Commissioner Stewart, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, a comment. I like seeing that these materials are being proposed. I think if we do get some pushback, you know, we can always consider them becoming, you know, maybe they're not the primary material on a building, maybe they're secondary, or they're used above the first floor or something like that. But I think there definitely is a place for them in the district.
Thank you.
That's a good suggestion, Commissioner. Thank you.
Commissioner Phillips?
You seem to be muted, Commissioner Phillips.
Yeah, working on it. Okay, yes, I agree that there's some composites out there that probably are great, but I ran into a situation once where as there, you know, even wood has different qualities of wood.
Yes.
You know, I think we all know that. Okay, so I can picture a composite being in the same circumstance, having a company that makes composites, but you got the A grade composite and you got the D grade composite. So I'm not saying we got a problem with this. I don't. Okay, but I think whoever's going to be implementing it on a case by case basis, you could have one house that looks awful and another one that looks great using the same company composite. So I don't know how you figure that problem out. I don't know if we need to or not, but something to think about, because, in the homeowners association that I was in, we had a choice of a $2,000 pergola or a $10,000 pergola. And once one of our board members figured out, you don't want that $2,000 one because the wood's going to fall apart in about 5 years. All right. So anyway, it's just a comment. I don't know how you deal with that.
Actually, with projects in both of those overlays, you have very extensive overlay standards. First of all, we also require that an applicant provide us a color and materials board. So we do have the ability to vet the materials that are going to be used on the exterior cladding. That includes, cut sheets for windows and doors, trim, all of that. So a lot of times it's now electronic, but we can dig into the quality of those materials. I'm not sure how like you said, even real wood comes with its own problems. So I'm not quite sure how to regulate that, but we can look into it and see if there's a way to pull out the lower quality materials.
Another question by Commissioner Stewart.
Yeah, in the end, it really comes down to detailing. You can have the best, most expensive looking material there is, but if it isn't detailed well, it's not good. So I think having the review process that you have and reviewing how these materials are detailed, I think you'll get to a good product.
We do try. And I know applicants do as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to continue moving forward with that one. Thank you for your feedback. It's very appreciated. Okay, the next one, we touched a little bit on, actually that was just accessory units. So this next one deals with accessory dwelling units. And as you noticed over the years, we've gotten a little bit more flexible. First, we didn't allow them, and then we allowed them as secondary dwelling units, but we had all sorts of restrictions in place, like the owner had to occupy one, you had to provide an off-street parking space. And then we got more flexible based on state regulations. And with the updated accessory dwelling unit standards, we implemented some design standards that go with ADUs that are within a certain proximity to a property line. Like you can't have really low windows if you're close to a property line because there's a potential privacy impact there. If you have a door, it has to be oriented away from the front street, and it can't be too close again to a side property line. So there's some ADU specific, design standards there. And because we want to make sure that we have flexibility that encourages people to build ADUs, we also allow minor variances to those design specific standards. What we don't allow minor variances to are the zone dimensional standards in place specifically to locate and site that ADU. So you can't get a minor variance to a required setback, to the overall size of the ADU or the height of the ADU. You just have to comply with whatever zone dimensional standards are in place. But again, you can get minor variances to some of the very design specific ones dealing with windows and doors. So looking at the existing code, this originally started out as a maintenance amendment because when I was trying to read the code, my mind kept going in circles, and I thought, let's just clarify this existing language. So just reads a little better for the layperson. But what it was pointed out was now that we have middle housing in place, where you're going to be getting duplexes where you only could have detached single family, or triplexes or quads, does it make as much sense to heavily regulate which ADU standards you can get a minor variance to and which couldn't? So maybe the better option would be to explore relaxing the minor variance restrictions for ADUs, similar to how duplexes and triplexes are a little bit, you still have to comply with the standards, but you can get some variances to them. So just sort of checking in with the commission to see how you felt about that, about having just gone through the middle housing project, whether or not we kind of want to lump in ADUs as a part of that, since we're going to see more flexible housing types on these properties. If we want to make sure that there's a little bit of flexibility when it comes to variances, so we can continue seeing ADUs on these properties.
Commissioners, anyone? I feel you should leave it in place the way it is, because these are structures that are in addition to an existing structure on a lot, whereas middle housing is new housing on individual lots. And it's kind of apples and oranges. That's my take.
So to clarify that one, would it be, would you be supportive of clarifying that existing language just so it reads a little bit smoother, but not?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think, Johanna, I think in fairness, we should probably give some examples of what some of those, ADU specific standards are, because they really are specific to that building type or
Yeah.
use. So like, for example, an ADU is limited to 800 square feet, except in floor area, except that up to 1,000 square feet is allowed where it's a remodel. And so that additional floor area was allowed to take into account, floor plans and existing structures where you might have hallways, or you might have equipment, you might have HVAC units, and you don't have the luxury of being able to design that space from scratch. So some additional space was afforded for a remodel. Now that's a hard standard. There's no variance, there's no exception to that. Other ADU standards, an ADU entrance shall be placed no closer than 10 feet to a property line. So that was, with respect to privacy or, imposition on neighbors. You have to have a 6-foot tall site obscuring fence around the property line where the ADU, if it's a detached ADU.
And excuse me for interrupting, Director Siegel, those standards, those 3 standards there under subsection E, those actually are ones you can get minor variances to. So we do have some flexibility when it comes to that fence or the proximity of the door. But we don't, as far as like the first example you brought up, the overall ADU size, there's no flexibility there. So converting, say, a non-conforming 900 square foot accessory structure, you could only convert 800 square feet of that. And we've actually encountered that scenario where you had to leave this kind of awkward extra portion of it as a not ADU, still part of the accessory structure, but not an ADU. So.
Okay, well, that's good to know. And obviously not more than one ADU is allowed on the lot, but were there other standards that this change would, other changes that this amendment would affect, Johanna?
It's really, so I think the 2 that we've seen, and again, this is not, I haven't dug into this all as much. This is not one of the code amendments that I brought forward for discussion. So I want to get back to staff and to the city attorney's office to see what came from this. But you have, like you said, that maximum size, 800 square feet for a new detached structure or internal conversion. There's a little flexibility there. But then there's just a subsection here, D, that says the unit has to be in conformance with site development requirements of the underlying zone. And no variances are allowed specifically to get an ADU. So you couldn't, for example, if you had a lot where you have a primary structure and you didn't have enough lot coverage to get an 800 square foot ADU, you'd either have to reduce the size of the ADU or you couldn't get it. You couldn't get a minor variance. Well, you can't get a minor variance to lot coverage. I'm sorry, that's a poor example. You couldn't, let's say setbacks, same scenario. The way that the existing primary structure is built, there wasn't a place to locate an ADU in compliance with a detached accessory structure setbacks. You couldn't get a minor variance to get, say, a 20% reduction to that setback in order to build the ADU. You'd have to figure out some other way to put it on your site, or you wouldn't be allowed to build the ADU.
Who brought this to your attention?
I think it's just come up. We've seen a lot more accessory dwelling units coming forward in the past. Once the standards got relaxed a little bit, we didn't require that the property owner live in one of the units. So we've seen a lot more accessory dwelling units coming forward, either as preliminary proposals or actually building permits. So you've seen an uptick there. And I think that, we have a lot of odd shaped lots or lots that were really built out. And we've had to tell people, I'm sorry, there's not enough flexibility or room or footprint or available lot coverage on your site to do this. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's an overwhelming problem. It's just sort of a continual issue that we don't allow any variances to those zone dimensional standards for an ADU, and it's closed off that option on a couple of occasions.
And Johanna, those minor variances to those standards would be available for what? For like a single family addition or
Yes.
duplex or middle housing? I mean, what are we talking about?
Yeah, so minor variances, there's a list of minor variances. And I think the most common one that we see are like setback reductions. And those are available to single family and middle housing right now. You can get it like a 20% reduction to a setback for a single family or middle housing. You could even do it for a detached accessory structure, but if it turns into an accessory dwelling unit, you can't get a variance. You cannot get a variance specifically to build an ADU on your property.
I think we should leave the standards the way they are and not muddy the waters with middle housing standards. And anybody else have a feeling about that, commissioners? Seeing no further input or questions.
So the feedback would be to make this a maintenance amendment and to just modify the language to clarify it a little bit.
It's ultimately up to the applicant just pushing this forward. You have the planning commission's, sort of an initial take, but they're not deliberating. So you might explain it better, or you might want to say what you want to do.
I think, Johanna, if we were going to come back with this as the policy amendment that you've outlined, we would want to provide some concrete examples of where, the public interest would really be served by having this flexibility. And I think, as you've said, we've seen an increase in construction of ADUs, and some of that I think is due in part to the flexibility that the commission and the council have already put into the code. So, we could come back if there's evidence or there's information that would support expanding that variance opportunity and, include that in the hearing draft. Or alternatively, you may see this as more of just a clarifying code amendment. So I think we'll need to study it further.
Okay.
That's my take on it.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to draft language either way, and then I'm also going to just clarifying the code. And then I'm also going to talk to the rest of the current planning staff to see if they have any examples of where not having the variances was an issue. And then maybe talk to those property owners to see if I can get contact information to see how they managed with that. And I'll flesh it out a little bit more and bring it back for the commission's consideration for the second work session.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, excuse me. Thank you. Okay, so this last one, yes. Okay, so there are only 6 policy amendments. This last one was an interesting situation where this was actually a partition that I did in 2021. And this is an R10 zone property in the Uplands overlay. And they came in, they had an existing home. You can see outlined on that front lot, and they got approval to partition their property and create a flag lot in the back where they could build a new single family home. Currently, the Uplands overlay only allows one access point, one driveway along a frontage. So even if you had like 100 feet of frontage, you couldn't put in a circular driveway within the Uplands overlay. They just wanted to minimize the number of access points on each of the streets in this area. So when I talked to the property owners at the pre-application conference and we were going over the standards and how it would apply, when I realized that they wanted to keep this existing home, I saw an immediate problem when we talked about it, because I said, look, your existing garage is on the opposite side of the property where you have to put in the access lane serving the flag lot in the back. And the requirement now is both of those driveways have to hook up and come out onto Wembley Park Road, that street, at the same point. And so this is actually a screenshot of the approved plan, which shows that you have the access lane on the north side of the site. Then you have a driveway in this very awkward way that goes right across the front yard and into the existing garage. And so that was an unintended consequence. And with the property owners and the planning consultant and with the Uplands neighborhood, we looked at ways to get around that. And the only relief that you have is a major variance. We can't get a grid review design variance to it because it's not one of the listed standards that you can use that process for. It's not a minor variance because it's not listed outright in the minor variance. If it's not a minor variance, it's automatically a major variance. Now, a major variance comes with a threshold that you have to show that you don't have reasonable use of your property without the variance. Well, obviously, they had a plan that, although ugly and very awkward, did get them to a project that complied with code. So they couldn't cross that threshold and get a major variance to the standard. And that hasn't happened a lot. But again, we have one partition that's being pursued just north of this, and we actually just got another pre-application conference for another Uplands overlay property where they want to divide it. Fortunately, with the one that's coming up, they're going to demolish the existing home up front and just build 2 new homes one on each of the lots. So less of a complication. But looking at this and talking to the Uplands overlay, they were insistent that this was not the intent of the code, and they really would want to find a way to use a variance to get there. But in the 2 scenarios that I've looked at, it didn't seem possible. And so I said, well, what about exploring putting in a small exception, a very limited exception, where we say that you can get a second access point if you can show that consolidation into one is not practicable. And there was a lot of resistance to that with the Uplands board. And we went back and forth, and they said, look, the important thing here is we don't want circular driveways. And we want to make sure that what we end up with on these partitions is an attractive design. And so we're still talking it over with them to see if there's something that they can support. But again, this is not the outcome that they were hoping for, and an unintended consequence to having that driveway access point, a very important regulation that they'd like to keep in place. But they'd also are willing to consider a very limited exception for minor partitions that have a flag lot when it's not practicable, no circular driveways. So we're still kind of tossing it around. I'm not sure at this point if there's much for the commission to give feedback on, unless you have some examples on ways to word it, or what possible pitfalls you see with getting a little bit of flexibility in that limited circumstance, but just sort of opening it up for discussion.
Seems to me they want their cake and eat it too. Commissioner Stewart?
Is this requirement unique to the Uplands neighborhood, or does this come up in other neighborhoods?
Well, it's interesting that you say that. There is a provision for a second access point, so like a circular driveway if you have 75 feet of frontage or more. So there are probably lots where you couldn't have that second driveway. But really where we see this coming into play is with standard partitions, because the flag lot standards actually require access point consolidation for the 2 or 3 lots altogether, unless shown not to be practicable. And so they're in the flag lot standards themselves, they have that built-in flexibility. So if you have a existing home, let's just say this is a partition not in the Uplands overlay, say over off of Goodall Road. If you have a front lot with an existing home that you want to preserve and you want to create a lot in the back, a flag lot, in this scenario, you would be able to keep the existing driveway point and have the flag lot access lane on the other side, and you wouldn't be required to consolidate them. So it was just that's where I went. I said, look, the flag lot standards already have this flexibility, but the Uplands overlay supersedes the flag lot standards. So I've got the flexibility of one standard, and then it's superseded with the other, and then this was the result. And again, I'm not sure that it's a very common scenario. I would just hate to be here again and see yet another driveway crossing a front yard like this.
This is baffling to me, why you can't have one access per lot, even if the lot's behind another lot, because I mean, all you have to say is, if this is allowed, you can simply say that you're not allowed to have a circular drive. I mean, everybody knows what that is, but
you would have 2 access points on this lot.
But there's,
they-
it's two lots though. There's lot
Yeah, I
one.
know, right. I agree.
Yeah,
So-
and I wasn't, Sarah Selden, a former planner, worked with the Uplands Neighborhood Association to draft this overlay. And I don't remember any of us when we were helping them go over the code, considering this potential scenario. This is one of those ones where you're like, oh, shoot, here I am at a pre-application conference for a partition, and this is a wrinkle none of us anticipated. So
Yeah, it seems like this needs to get worked out because this is a terrible solution.
it's an interesting one. You have the street, and then you have the public pathway, and you have a little bit of landscaping, and then you have a driveway in the front yard. It's
Yeah, the driveway is, I realize you're not accessing lot one from the street, but the driveway's there. So,
yeah.
it-
So so you're aware, the Uplands overlay also comes with an impervious surface limitation for the front yard. You can't have more than 30% of the front yard covered in impervious area. So one of the other wrinkles with this is they had to use some sort of pervious material for a portion of that new driveway hooking up to the access lane.
So my 2 cents is we should give them the leeway to accommodate a more practical solution that also does not allow a circular driveway.
Yeah, and I think that's very much in keeping with what the Uplands overlay was willing to talk about. And again, I've been talking mostly to Chair Bob Urban, and he's been doing outreach to the board members. I don't know that he has 100% support there, so I'll continue working with him and making sure that any concerns they have about this are addressed. But we'll have to see how that works out. But thank you both for the feedback there. Any other questions from the commissioners?
I see none.
Okay, well, that is it. I said it was going to take 2 hours, a little bit less than 2 hours. Thank you so much for helping me get through this as quickly as possible. And appreciate all of your feedback tonight. Like I said, we'll be back on September 26th, and I'll have some draft amendments, more discussion, examples, as we've been talking about tonight. Hopefully we'll come back with a full set of code amendments that the commission can support and move forward to public hearing. So I very much appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Very well done. Thank you. Our next on the agenda is other business. Do we have any other business to discuss? Seeing none, how about a schedule review?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Leak. Your next regularly scheduled meeting is August 22nd. It'll be a field trip. You're meeting with representatives of the Palisades Neighborhood Association for a tour of a portion of their neighborhood that they're studying for a possible overlay zone. We'll send out meeting information. The meeting starts at 5 o'clock. That was the time that the commissioners and the neighborhood association wanted. We'll be meeting I'll give you the address and it'll be on the agenda. We're going to meet on site and then it's a walking tour from there. Plan on about 90 minutes altogether for that. The next meeting after that is September 12th, and you'll have a work session, ongoing work on the review of the non-conforming development standards. And staff is doing outreach to the community, including industry, Home Builders Association, and neighborhoods on that item. That was the direction that you had provided at your last work session. And then following that, you have a meeting on the 26th of September. And as you heard from Senior Planner Hastay, you're scheduled to review draft code amendments in a work session for the annual CDC changes. And then also on the 26th, tentatively scheduled is actually the first actual work session on the Palisades planning process, probably to debrief and discuss, what you learned from your tour. And that concludes the schedule update.
Thank you very much, Director Siegel. Without any further business to take care of. Do we have a motion to adjourn? I guess we will just adjourn then. Thank you all for participating and have a lovely evening.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you, Iris.
You're
Night,
welcome.
everyone.
Thank you.